Hello and welcome back to this tutorial. In our previous video, we learned how to create our packages and modules. We also learned how to use some standard libraries or beauty modules in Python. And we also learned how to create a virtual environment. In this video, we are going to go ahead to create functions and classes inside the modules that we created earlier so that we can import them just like we've been importing our standard libraries and third parties library into this raw main.py file, right? So you can liken this main.py file to just a regular Python file that you're importing something into. So we are going to convert these modules to importable objects, and then we are going to import them into this main.py file, and we are going to use them to perform basic file handling and data analytics actions. All right. So now remember that in our virtual environment, we had already installed matplotlib and pandas inside this our virtual environment. All right, so we are going to be utilizing everything that you have done so far in this module to work in this file. So the first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to rename these folders that are here to suit their various purposes. So I am going to rename this, and instead of sample package 1, I'm going to call it handler package, okay, because it's going to perform file handling action for us. And this module, I am just going to call it handler. Okay, so now the second package, I'm going to rename it to analytics, right? And inside this analytic package, I'm going to rename these modules to suit what they are going to need. So first of all, the data analytics actions that we are going to perform is, first of all, we are going to filter and clean up our data, right? For the second module, we are going to use that module to group and also plot our data. So I can call this one processing, and this I'm going to call grouping.py, right? So now, having effected all of these changes, the first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to go to the handler package, all right, and I am going to create my file handling classes. And based on what we learned from our object oriented programming course, we were able to create classes and then create methods inside those classes, right? So for this particular file or this particular module, I'm going to create 3 different classes. The first class is going to be an abstract class, and the second class and the third class are going to handle CSV and JSON files respectively. So I am going to import some of the modules that I'll be needing. So I'm going to write my import statements from ABC, import capital letter ABC and abstract method. Okay, then because we are going to be working with JSON file, I'm going to import JSON, then import CSV. Also, I am going to be needing the typing built-in library, right? And I am going to just write from typing that I'm going to import, well, any, right? And that is when you are allowing any type of data, right? Then I'm going to import dict, because we are going to be using dictionaries to create our files, and then list. So we are going to be using these data types to work. And I'm also going to import OS, right? And these are the modules or libraries that we are going to be working with. Then I'm going to go ahead to create my abstract class, and I'm going to call it file handling. And I'm going to pass in the ABC class, and I'm going to close this. So here I'm going to define my init function for this class. So underscore init, and here VS Code is calling the super init for us because we are inheriting from ABC, but we don't need it, so we are just going to get rid of that. And the next thing we're going to do is that, well, what are the things that we'll be needing for file handling? We'll be needing a file path, right? Underscore path, and we want the file path to be a string. Okay, so now I'm going to define the instance attributes for this class. So I'm going to say that self dot file path underscore path is equals, well, file path, right? And then in this class also, I'm going to create my getters and setters for this file path that will be able to return the file path for us. Okay, and because of that, I'm going to set this file path to be a protected instance attribute. So first of all, I'm going to set my setter method. So I am going to use the at filepath underscore path dot setter. Okay, and I'm going to define setter method. So I'm going to call it filepath. Okay, and then I'm going to open and close this. So here I'm going to open and close this, and here I'm going to pass in self and new filepath. Okay, so as you can see, PS Code is complaining because we don't have a getter function for this yet. So I'm going to set a getter function for this. So I'm going to use at property decorator, and I'm going to define the getter. So, and I'm going to call it filepath, and then I'll pass in self. So for this getter, what are we doing? Well, the only thing that we are doing is that we are returning the value of self dot underscore filepath. Okay, that's the only thing this function is going to do for us. So coming back to our setter, I am going to just set the filepath using this. So I'm going to indent my code, and I am going to just say that self dot filepath will now be the new filepath. Okay, so here we are returning a string. Okay, so after we get the filepath, we are going to return a string, and after we set the filepath here, we are going to return none. So the next thing I'm going to do is to create two abstract methods that we are going to implement in our subclasses, right? So I'm going to use the at abstract method decorator, and I'm going to define my method. So the first method that I'm going to define is going to be a read method. So I am going to call it read, and I am going to pass in self and closing this. And the only thing I'm going to write here is just pass, right? And the next one, I will copy this and paste, and I'm going to change this read to write. Okay, and here I'm going to write pass again. So now I'm going to create my JSON file handler class. So I'm going to write my keyword class, and I'm going to call it JSON handler. So it is going to inherit from file handling. So I'm going to close up this place. Now here I'm going to implement the read method. So you can see VS Code is already defining the read method for us, but here we are going to write our own implementation. So we are not returning the super read method. So first of all, we are going to check whether filepath exists, right? So I'm going to say if not os dot path dot exists. So that is if the filepath does not exist. So, and the path that we are talking about is the filepath. All right. So what do we do if this path does not exist? So it means the file does not exist. So we are going to return a print statement, and it's going to be a formatted string. And this formatted string is simply going to say that the filepath does not exist. So I will just say file, and the file is going to be, well, self.filepath does not exist. Okay, then if this is not the case, that means the file exists. Then we are now going to use our with open to open the file in a read mode. So with open self.filepath, which is a string, and we are going to open in read mode, and we are opening it as f. So after we open it, we are going to just say, well, that data will now be JSON dot load f, right? And then after we load it, we now return data. So next we are going to implement the write method. So I'm going to define it and I'll call it right. So I'm not using the super, I'm implementing something else. So I'll pass in self, pass in data, that is the data that will be passed, and the data can be of any type, right? And we are returning none. Just create the file, don't return anything. Okay, so here we are now going to use a concept called try except. So I'm just going to write the keyword try, and what do we want Python to try? We want it to try and open a file. Okay, so we are not returning anything, so return none, and that error is cleared. So now we are going to try to open the file. So we are going to say try and open self.filepath, which is a string in a write mode. Save it as F, okay? And after you are done, the next thing you're going to do is json dot dump, and we want to dump the data inside the JSON file, and we want to dump it inside file, and we want to use the indent of 2, right? So then the next block we are going to work with is the except block. So I'm going to say that except this opening of file or writing of file was not successful, use type error as E. After you save this error, right, what you're going to do is raise type error, and we call out the string, the error that we want to display. So we are going to print a formatted string that says was not able to create data, and I'm going to pass in E here. Okay, so I'm going to remove this in order to clear this error. And the next thing we are going to do is to also create the CSV file handler. So I'm going to copy this class and just make a few changes to this so that this video will not be too lengthy, although it's already becoming too lengthy. So I'm going to change this to CSV file handler. So it's going to be CSV handler. And on the read method, what we are going to do is that we are going to check for the file path, and if the file path does not exist, we are going to say, well, that file path does not exist. But if it exists, we are going to now read the CSV. So we are only going to change the read functions. So instead of json.load, what we are going to have here is that reader is equal to csv.dictReader, and we are going to pass in the file, and then we are going to return all the rows that we have read. Okay, so we are going to return a list of all the rows. So I'm going to say row for row in reader. Okay, and also we are going to change the write function a bit, and because the CSV file, it kind of has some custom data that are passed into it, I'm going to change this write function, and the kind of data that we want is a list, right? So I'm going to say that I want a list. So, and that list is going to be a list of dictionaries, and the dictionary should contain 2 items, right? And the first item should be a string, and the second item can be any data type. And then we are returning none. Okay, so VS Code has already completed that for us. So, and then we are going to go ahead to check if the data is not a string, then we are going to raise an error. And also if the length of the data is 0, then we are going to raise an error again. So the first thing we're going to do is that if not is instance. So what are we checking? The data that will be passed in, and it should be a list. Okay, so if this is not the case, if this condition is not true, then we are going to raise an error, and that error is type error. So the type error that we saw before, and we are just going to write in CSV handler expect a list of dictionaries. Okay, then if that is not the case, so I'm going to write another if statement that will say if the length, we are going to check if the data was that the list that was passed in contained no data. So I'm going to pass in data here, and I'm going to say, well, equals. We know how to do that. So what do we do if this is the case? We are going to raise value error. So I'm going to say something like, you passed in an empty list. And after we have checked for these two conditions, I am simply going to write the file. So now we are going to do our with open, and I'm going to say self._file path, and we are opening in write mode. So we can say mode equals write is the same thing. And we are going to remove new lines, right? So I won't have empty new lines. So I'm going to say as f. So I'm going to create my writer variable, and I'm going to set it to csv.dictWriter, and I'm going to pass in the file. Okay, so I want to change the name to file. I think my VS Code is a bit slow right now. So, and I'm going to pass in the file. And I'm going to pass in field names. So, and the field names we are going to be getting dynamically, and it's going to be the keys of the dictionaries, right? So the first item in the dictionary, then in the data dot key. So I'm going to call writer dot write header. So I'm going to loop over the rows. So I'm going to write my for loop in data. So, and I'm going to say writer dot write rows. Okay, so we have an error here because we didn't put a comma, right? And the next thing that we are going to do, so we seem to be having an error somewhere. So we are, and the error is on line 39. So I think this is the error, and I'm going to just add comma here, and the error will be cleared. Okay, so now we have created our file handling module, and in our next video, we are going to be creating our data analytics module, and then subsequently we'll move on to implement them in our main.py file. So thank you so much for watching this video. See you in the next one.